All right, so today we're going to build upon yesterday's discussion of emotional vocabularies by considering how different emotions can mobilize compassion and be kind of an antidote to some of these more disengaged or stagnant feelings that keep us from actively engaging in climate action. We're going to look at apathy, anger, collective resilience, and finally ending on that note of hope and optimism. We'll have a little bio break in the middle, so you guys will be able to get up and get some water. And we will do another mindfulness exercise where we practice holding space for duality. So finding kind of a spaciousness in between difficult, potentially conflicting feelings. And then we'll end with a lot of room. There'll be plenty of room all throughout for discussion and conversation. Can you guys see my presentation okay? Yeah, okay, I just got a funny notification from Zoom. Okay, great. So we all know each other here. So if you guys are ready, we'll just move forward into a little activity just to kind of check in. So there's this saying that I've encountered multiple times reading books and doing research on this topic that's, if we love it, we will save it. And I really resonated with that. I grew up in Colorado in the mountains. So I spent a lot of time skiing, hiking, being outside. And it's part of the reason I love Scotland. We are surrounded by immense natural beauty here. And I know most of us have really significant places in nature that have comforted us or inspired us or humbled us over the years. So in my meditations, sometimes when in a guided meditation, they'll ask you to come up with an image of a place or a person that inspires a sense of like peace and tranquility. I often use a mental image of this lake, which is not far from my hometown. It's called Sylvan Lake. And it really just, it's so stunning, and it really reminds me of this feeling of like safety and security and like comfort. So I wonder if we can just go around, since we're a little group, and share a little bit about one place that's important to you and why it's special. Maybe it's a place from your childhood or where you live now. But I'd love to hear why it's important to you and what makes it so special. Sam, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, sure. I guess just off the top of my head, I saw your image, and it immediately reminded me of a few places that I've also visited. Being from Nepal, I also love hiking, trekking, and these kind of outdoor activities. So there's this region in Nepal that's bordering Tibet. It's called the Mustang Valley. And it's a mountainous region, but at the same time, it's also a desert. So the juxtaposition of mountains and desert. So in that way, it's a very beautiful place. And when I had visited that place, it was in 2013. Yes, the first time in 2013. So there's a particular place called Muktinath, which is at a height of about 3,800 meters above sea level. So from there, we are driving down to the base, which is called Jomsum. So when we were coming down, it was a stunning drive down. And there was a particular point where I just decided, I asked the group that, is it okay if I just get off here and I just walk back to Jomsum? It was about a 3 hours walk. So it is just me in literally in the middle of nowhere, desert, mountains. And one feature about that area that I really, really love is because, so Nepal, the Indian subcontinent rather, it was actually an island millions and millions, 65 million years ago. And when it pushed up with the Eurasian plate, that's when the Himalayas were formed. And you could see the hills there as a cross section on the hills. You could see a lot of weird different colors. There was purple, there was pink, there was orange, like a very Picasso kind of a painting kind of thing. And it was beautiful just walking along. looking at that, walking along the river. So that's a place that has always stayed with me, especially in this context of nature and talking about climate change. Now, that region is facing a lot of difficulties when it comes to climate change. I mean, just off the top of my head, the I'm not sure if everyone knows there's a mosquito-borne disease called dengue, right? So it's generally a disease that's associated with the tropics or with hotter climates. But because of climate change and the rise in temperatures in Nepal, at that place, which is at a height of between 3,000 to 3,500 meters above sea level, dengue has been spotted there as well. So it's very, very concerning and very, very like a wake up call that we need to do something about this issue in those areas as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And I love hearing about that area. I really want to go trekking there. Catherine, do you want to go next?
Sure. Before I came to Glasgow, I have been living in the city next to Shanghai in China for probably 16 years. And there is a lake. It's like one of the biggest lake in China, probably in the world. It's massive. To me, it's like an ocean, because where I grew up, there's no ocean at all. So first time I got to the lake, by the way, the name of the lake is Taihu. Tai is the name. Hu in Chinese means lake. So Taihu is the name. If you Google it, you probably find some image of it. It's massive. But why it is important to me, because the time I visited there was the kind of a low point in my life. Because I found a piece of a kind of peaceful mind there. I drive, it's kind of remote from the city. In China, every city is quite big, so you have to drive like hours to some place like that. Usually what I did is I drove there, and I just parked my car next to the lake and I just watch the view and have a book with me and doing absolutely nothing, just sit there for the whole afternoon. And somehow just calming down. I just don't really think too much anymore, just completely being present with the water. And also I explore a little bit. At that time, back like almost 8 or 10 years ago, there are a lot of villages. They are not being commercialized yet. Nowadays, they have been developed into some kind of tourism place. But before it wasn't. I found it so interesting because I guess part of me being a little bit low at that point is that I reached the point that I've been a little bit sick of this so-called modern civilization, the city, busy every day, like everything's a bit overwhelmed. And I just found a peace of mind there. We just walk around the kind of abandoned villages. Nobody lived there anymore. But you can tell the village used to have so delicate decoration about the doors, about the walls, and the buildings, like a wooden building, a second floor, but it's abandoned completely, like nobody, like a ghost house. But it's so like it represents something that you missed, and it's kind of valuable. You just ignore the value that from your own culture or whatever, and pursue the so-called the modern financial success, and that could be part of the down point that I have. So I guess my research topics again is about entrepreneurial well-being. Basically it's at the core, it's about individual well-being. So I'm always obsessed with the kind of nature, peaceful mindset and lifestyle. Even we have to integrate that with business. Somehow we cannot avoid that. But I'm sure I'm very determined that we can find we are clever and hardworking enough to find a solution, certain kind of balance. So I'm thinking, I'm fascinated by this because it's nature. I always like find solution back to nature, because in China there's a philosophy called Taoism, and some people in China, there's not very serious religious culture, but there's a lot of so-called religions, but they're not religions, they're like a philosophy. The way you understand everything, how the world is running, it's not just because it's not about the human society, it's also about the world, the nature. They have their own circles, they have their own rules. And whatever we do, we are part of the nature. We just need to follow the rules. Sometimes we do too much artificial stuff that kind of messed up with the rhythm of the nature. And the Taoism is a philosophy basically asking us to go back to nature. So I found that everything now makes so much sense, because we talk about the environmental impact on human individual well-being. It has somehow it all connected, even we are in a different disciplines. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, nature has an amazing ability to kind of take us out of all of these narratives and these ideas about what we should be pursuing and what should be important to us, and kind of bring us back into the body, into the direct experience. Kirsten, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I would say a place that's important to me is Glencoe, which is like kind of on the way up to Fort William in the Highlands of Scotland. And yeah, that's quite a significant place to me in various ways. My granny is from Fort William, and we used to always get the bus up, a couple of times a year or whatever to visit her. And it's a really stunning bus journey. And I feel like that's been something that's kind of punctuated my life at various points, like those long bus journeys through the hills and the valleys. And yeah, I just always kind of associate it with, it's always really clear snapshots in my mind of like different stages of my life when I was making that same journey. And I'm from Glasgow, I'm from a big city, but I always loved going up to the Highlands to visit my family. And I think it's really kind of important in the sort of path I've taken in life as well, because it's a glaciated valley, and that when I started learning about all of those earth processes in secondary school and secondary geography, that was really kind of transformational for me in terms of understanding how the world works, and things aren't just fixed, and everything in nature is always kind of moving, even something like valleys that you just think are sort of set in stone, as it were. There's always these kind of underlying processes that are just going on at a kind of imperceptible time frame. So yeah, to me, that's now the work that I'm doing today is all about that, is kind of bringing those processes to life through creative understandings, alongside scientific understandings, and as a way of forging kind of deeper connections, not just through knowledge but through emotion, through the senses. And I think that's why I'm so interested in the topic of glaciers, is because I had those experiences that are really kind of woven into my life through these journeys that I would make every year, and just being in a place that I really loved and I kind of found sort of fascinating as well. So yeah, that would be my place, Glencoe.
Glencoe is beautiful. And yeah, these places have a huge impact on our lives and the directions that we take, especially if they were significant places when we were young. And then they change over time too, which can be either perceptibly or imperceptibly. Like actually this lake does not look like this anymore because last summer all the surrounding hills were destroyed by a wildfire. So none of those trees are there anymore. All of it is brown and burnt. And yeah, I had really cultivated an image of this place in my head as like, a place of peace and tranquility and kind of safety. And so I really had to kind of reconcile with that on a very emotional level when the wildfire kind of destroyed it, because it was really, it is still a very important place. And of course it will regenerate too, which is kind of what I came back to at the end. Anyways, Megan, do you want to go? You want to finish us off?
Sure, just very briefly. So I grew up in Northern Ontario, Canada, which is heavily wooded and lots of lakes. So one of my favorite places is it's a park called Hiawatha, which is an indigenous, it's indigenous land, as all of Canada is obviously, but there's very much still a vibrant connection between this park and the indigenous tribes of the area. And it's beautiful. It is open to the public, which is very gracious. And in the fall, it just turns like electric orange. The leaves just turn color in such a beautiful way. So I would just spend hours biking through it, hiking, running with my dog, swimming in the lakes. And I think the most noticeable change has been the decline in biodiversity. You know, I remember you would always hear birds and sea critters. And now when I go for a hike there, oftentimes it's just silent. You just sort of notice the absence of the birds. You don't hear their songs anymore or nearly as much. But I still, yes, I guess like Dalen, I have sort of a memory in my mind of what it was versus maybe what it is now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So we will kind of touch back to this at the very end also. But for now, we're going to move forward into our first module on apathy. So apathy is one of the kind of difficult emotions that we talked about with Barb yesterday. It's a common emotional response for us, for our research participants. And it can be tempting for us to judge people for being disengaged, but we really need to understand what it is and where it comes from. So apathy, the term in terms of etymology, the prefix a means without, and the root of the second part of the word pathos alludes to the concept of feeling. So it's this emptiness of feeling, this kind of void of emotion. When you just don't care anymore, you just can't be bothered. And it can be intentional or unintentional. Sometimes it's even unconscious, but it's this like deep disengagement, almost like a disassociation. It might translate into actual behaviors, or it might just be kind of going on behind the scenes mentally and emotionally. But it's this kind of like shrugging our shoulders, like, well, there's not much I can do anyways. And you know, what it comes from is we're shelving all of these difficult feelings. So we're choosing to disengage, not necessarily choosing, sometimes it's not a conscious choice, but we're disengaging before we have to face the difficult, potentially vulnerable feelings. I know that some of you guys mentioned feeling this way yesterday. There's a lot of explanations why we feel apathy. Some people say it's just a form of denial. This article by Basari, it's actually an opinion piece in The Guardian. He talks about why we actively choose to deny via apathy. And he thinks it's because, you know, climate change is abstract. It's hard for us to get our heads around. It's future focused and kind of like sometimes geographically distant. So it's not necessarily that present in our daily lives. It's also somewhat politically contentious, not so much its existence anymore, but what we should do about it is still politically contentious. And it's just hugely complex. It's impossible for one person or even one group to tackle alone. And when, excuse me, when we feel kind of alone or abandoned by our governments, distrustful of higher authorities, that sense of inefficacy and apathy deepens. So for Basari, there are just all these psychological barriers to really coming to grips with climate change. It's just too hard for our brains to wrap around, so we choose to deny via disengagement. I think that's kind of like a a pretty ruthless explanation and one that lacks a little bit of self-compassion. So I would just add the perspective that apathy is protective. It's a protective mechanism. And that's what McLaren talks about. So Carla McLaren argues that there's actually some genius in apathy. She's the author of a book that's called Emotional Resilience, I think, emotional something. But she argues that apathy is protective in that it sets a boundary. We might be seeking distraction because we've hit our max. That kind of short-lived hit of feel-good hormones keeps us from dealing with the difficult feelings and the kind of underlying suffering. You know, if I'm saying like, oh, I just can't be bothered, I'm shutting down the conversation before we get to the core vulnerability, you know? So it's protective because it stems from repression, and that means it can be problematic. It can be a sign that we're starting to feel like a product of our own environment instead of an active and aware participant. And it's often a sign of emotional repression or avoidance or disassociation. So it allows us to mask our true feelings just so that we can get through the day. Because sometimes we do just need to get through the day. We all have to live in this society that we are inevitably somewhat complicit in the climate crisis. As individual humans, we can't sustain the energy to fight climate change, give it our all every single day, all day. Just like we can't be industrious, we can't be out working and you know, hunter gathering even for all day, every day. We need periods of rest. We need mental and emotional periods of rest in order to re-spark passion and drive. So apathy is really part of a cycle. Also, I just wanted to read this quote by Joanna Macy, who Barb alluded to yesterday, but we're gonna actually spend a lot of time with her today. She says, of all the dangers we face, from climate chaos to nuclear war, none is so great as the deadening of our response. So apathy is protective. It is part of a larger climate change cycle. It's just a flag. It's a messenger that lets us know that our boundaries are being pushed to their limits and that it's time to kind of stop and take restock and recuperate. Joanna Macy is a big proponent of deep ecology and talks about the value of seasonal thinking. So deep ecology is, for those who don't know, an environmental philosophy and really a social movement grounded in the belief that humans need to radically change their relationship to nature from one that values nature solely for its usefulness to human beings to one that recognizes nature as having inherent value. It was coined by a Norwegian philosopher in the 1970s, and it emphasizes this really spiritual relationship between humans and our environment and nature's sentience and the power of reciprocity. Joanna Macy is also the head of an organization called The Work That Reconnects, which I highly recommend looking into and potentially getting involved with if this is something that kind of speaks to you. This is one artist's representation of Joanna's method that kind of portrays what she talks about, this kind of cycle of renewal, one of many cycles. So this particular one starts with gratitude, you know, having gratitude that we had the presence of mind to stop and notice, gratitude for what was and what remains and what will be, and then honoring the pain that we feel, honoring the moments of apathy or despair or hopelessness, and then taking steps to practice self-kindness and find new perspective, and then taking that forward with us as we seek to act in a way that will create positive change. So there is a lot of comfort in seasonal thinking when it comes to emotions. It actually only takes 90 seconds for the physiological effects of an emotion to cycle through the body. This is the 90-second rule that was coined by Jill Bolte Taylor. She is a Harvard neuroanatomist. So basically, if I feel angry, My body is flooded with adrenaline, cortisol, my face gets maybe hot, my chest gets tight. All of those chemicals will flush out of my body in 90 seconds if I allow the emotion to run its course. When we get into trouble is when we suppress it, we push it down, and we stop those processes, and then we end up compounding them later on. Barb kind of mentioned that yesterday, but that's the kind of biology behind it. It's also the mental narrative that we map onto those emotions that keeps us trapped in the emotional feedback loop. So the physiological response is short-lived, but then when we take the physiological response and try to make meaning from it mentally, we get stuck in the feedback loop. So knowing that we will come through it, that it's all part of a cycle, kind of gives us permission to let that emotion run its course. Joanna Macy talks about partnering with your apathy. So taking moments of disengagement and frustration and hopelessness as a sign to do a few things. One, reevaluate your boundaries, reinvest in supportive relationships, maybe divest from unsupportive relationships, even if only temporarily. There's this saying, I'm sure there's some kind of research behind it, but there's this saying that you are the product of the 5 people closest to you. And the more, since I've heard that, the more I think about it, the more I believe it. Just to give you an example of, investing your energy in places that support you and people that support you. So when I first moved to Edinburgh, I got pretty involved in XR, in Extinction Rebellion. And I really wanted to feel like I was doing something. And I went to some actions, and I just found after about 6 months that it was really taking a huge toll on me personally. And this is a very, very personal thing. I think it is different for everyone, but some of the discourse and like some of the meetings were just, they were not leaving me feeling excited and hopeful and passionate about making a difference. If anything, it was having quite the opposite effect on me. And so I made the decision to stop going to meetings and to kind of remove myself from that environment. And, different strokes, different folks, it's different for everybody, but I have found that since then, I've been much more engaged and able to really take a hard look at my own behaviors and my own consumer decisions. And taking a step back from that was a boundary that I kind of had to set for myself in order to keep myself safe and healthy and able to continue to work towards solutions. Another key practice for overcoming apathy is finding spaces to feel your feelings. And then, of course, practicing self-compassion and self-kindness, because the more we berate ourselves, the more we kind of entrench these feelings of apathy and inefficacy. And just to elaborate on boundaries for a second, since 2007, media reports on climate change have increased by 78%. And the academic literature on climate and health issues has tripled. So we are inundated with information, and mostly negative information, day in and day out. And we have to recognize that headlines and news outlets intentionally choose the most clickbait-worthy language. Bad news sells and good news does not. So our ingrained negativity bias is really reflected in our media. And add that to the fact that we as human beings have a pretty limited evolutionary capacity to cope with suffering. So biologically and neurologically, we are not that much more advanced than our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Our brain only evolved really to process immediate concern over the suffering of the people that we considered to be in our group or in our tribe. We are not neurologically equipped to process the amount of suffering that we see on the news day in and day out, whether it's new natural disasters, social crises, famines, fires, plus all of the stuff that's happening right here, right now in our lives, which is why a lot of us end up feeling super disengaged and apathetic and indifferent. So we have to be really intentional about what we consume. During COVID, I massively cut back on my consumption of the news. I have almost always been someone who is very politically involved, reads the newspaper every morning. I get notifications on my news app. I have a podcast that I listen to on my walk with my dog every morning. Like, I am very engaged, and I was raised that way. My mom is the same way. But during COVID, I would go for a walk, listen to my podcast, see all these notifications about the death toll rising popping up on my phone. And it was so hard. I realized about 2 months in that it was so harmful for my mental health, that it was really having an adverse effect on me. And so I hugely cut back. I turned off all of my notifications. I stopped listening to the podcast. I really, for a while, when I was doing kind of like, when I was just trying to bounce back, I didn't really consume much news at all. I relied on my mom to tell me if there was anything big that I needed to know about. And now over the last couple of years, I've slowly picked that back up. And now I do believe it's important to be engaged and to know what's going on in the world. But we also have to balance that with taking care of ourselves. So it's kind of this like Goldilocks conundrum, like not too hot, not too cold, not too much, not too little. We want to consume enough media to be informed and engaged, but not so much to slip into total emotional exhaustion and overwhelm. And I don't know that we ever strike a perfect balance, but we can slowly become more and more aware of when we're slipping too far into one direction, and we can kind of course correct earlier. So it's this constant rebalancing. Some tips for that is just choose your media outlets wisely. Check their political biases, and check how many positive headlines they choose to include. Try and find providers with kind of balanced, nuanced perspectives. Check on when you're consuming news. So is it first thing in the morning or right before bed? And then consciously seek out good. So there are all kinds of newsletters now and news outlets specifically dedicated to like positive news. And I'm not saying exclusively consume those, because then you're going to end up with another very twisted view of the world. But there's a newsletter called the Harvard Optimist that's great, the Harvard Climate Optimist, I think. And Upworthy is a good one that everybody knows about. I follow some kind of silly ones on Instagram too that I won't necessarily name, but just to say that like that kind of levity and the cute animal videos and happy news, they have their place too. And they do a lot to help us kind of have a balanced perspective of what the world is like. And then just to say, in terms of designating spaces and practices for feeling your feelings, I want to flag for you guys that the Climate Psychology Alliance offers 3 free sessions for anyone who feels like they are struggling with their mental health related to climate change. They also offer these kind of drop-in events called climate cafes. And I highly recommend you check them out. They're all over the world. There's a few that are hosted here in Edinburgh, but they're actually online, so you can join from anywhere. I think it's about an hour long, and it's facilitated by a psychologist. And they just open up the floor for people to talk about what they're struggling with when it comes to climate change that day. And I've been to a few, and they're always very powerful. So we're going to move into an exercise. I just see, oh, thank you for posting those links, Megan. I'm going to close this down, stop sharing. Okay, and then let me pull this over here. So this is an exercise that inspired by the compassion program, again, that Barb and I did together. It's called the transformation technique, and we're going to practice this technique together. So find a nice, comfortable space where you won't be disturbed if you haven't already. This is something you can practice at home on your own. It is designed to help us hold space for difficult and potentially conflicting emotions, to bring about some balance and integration to situations where there might be some conflict and some suffering. So what we're going to do is we're going to verbally express. You're going to turn yourself on mute, so don't worry. No one will be able to hear you. We're going to verbally express our challenges and our hopes as it pertains to climate change. So any feelings of grief, anxiety, anger, as well as the hopes and dreams and positive traits that we feel we can bring to this difficult situation. We're going to bring those together with the aim of finding some integration and a greater sense of peace, knowing that there is room for both to coexist. When we put what we're feeling into words, studies have shown that there's a reduction of activity in the amygdala and increased activity in the prefrontal region of the brain. So this diminishes some of our reactivity by soothing our stress response and produces a kind of calming effect so that we can deal more effectively and skillfully with challenging situations. We're basically creating this kind of bridge, integrating this sense of inner division. And it retrains our brain's natural disposition towards negative thinking by enhancing and absorbing the positive sides or emotions of the situation. So it helps us find this place of like acceptance and skillful action. So find a comfortable seat. Feel free to turn off your camera if that'll help you turn your attention inwards and not feel self-conscious. Find your feet grounded flat on the floor, or if you'd prefer to lay down, that's fine, but find a posture that allows you to remain awake. That is key. So settle the body, maybe take a few shoulder rolls just to relax any tension in the musculature across the backs of the shoulders. Reach the crown up towards the sky so you can find some length, some openness across the chest. Free flow of air through the airways. As you find your posture, feel free to close down the eyes, or if that feels at all uncomfortable for you, you can just cast the gaze downwards. Soften the gaze, let it get a bit blurry. We'll begin with a few deep breaths in and out of the nose. So deep inhale all the way down into the belly. Feel the abdomen expand. And then a slow, smooth exhale also out the nose. Pressing all the air out. And then again, deep inhale, filling all the way up. Soften as you reach your capacity. And then a slow, smooth exhale. One more on your own. Deepest breath of the day. And release. Softening, expanding. And then just let your breath settle into a natural, easy rhythm. You might notice the feeling of your seat beneath you, the sturdiness of the chair or the bed that you're sitting on. Supporting you without you needing to do anything. And then notice the sensation of the breath moving through the body. Inflation of the chest and the belly, followed by a slow deflation. You might feel the air passing just below the nostrils, the top of the lip. Breath after breath. Just let the entire body be soft and at ease. Nowhere to be. Allow yourself to come into this moment. And just relax back. Give yourself permission to be here. And having grounded in the present moment, I'll ask you to bring to mind a climate-related event or an aspect of the climate crisis that has caused you some distress. We're not talking anything extremely traumatic or personal. Maybe a 2 or a 3 or a 4 on a scale of 10. It might be a natural disaster that you read about, or the potential loss of a particular species, or something that touched and affected you, caused you a sense of fear, anxiety, or grief, anger. Bring this event or situation to mind. Notice how your physical body is responding as you reflect on this event. And keep it neutral, so just noticing the physiological response. Maybe there's a tightening in the chest or some heat building in a certain part of the body. Maybe a tingling or speeding up of thoughts or breath. And just noticing. And let's take a couple deep breaths into whatever it is that you've noticed, whatever's here when you reflect on this challenging situation. And with the breath, again, giving this experience permission to be here. Now, I'll ask you to extend your right hand, palm face up out in front of you, or maybe it feels better to close your fingers in a fist, whatever feels most natural or intuitive. And I want you to verbally express all of your worries and fears and thoughts or feelings about this particular issue. So speak it out loud. If you want to scream and you're in a place where you can do it, go for it. But whispering is also completely fine. But I do want you to verbally externalize all of these challenging fears and grievances and anger. So just speak it aloud now and just envision yourself pouring those words into your right hand. I'll give you a few moments. And keep going. Let it be stream of consciousness. pouring all of these frustrations and fears into your right hand. And if the feelings become overwhelming at any time, just pause and take a deep breath. If you've run out of things to say, you might reflect on what you are afraid will happen. What's the worst part of this? You might verbalize the sensation. Just allow the feelings to arise and exist as sensations in the body until they subside or become less intense. Just a few more moments. Speaking aloud, whatever it is that you feel is plaguing you in relation to this climate crisis. Just wrapping up any final thoughts. And any last words, just seal them into the palm of your right hand. And then slowly, as you're ready, lower that hand down into your lap. Now, raising your left hand, you can again have the palm open or closed out in front of you. And speaking in the present tense, it's very important. Speaking in the present tense, I want you to speak out your vision for the future. So what is it that you want or desire? How would you like it to be? What is your intention? And just speak it out in the present tense as if it's already happening. And allow yourself to stretch here beyond maybe what you think is possible. So speak those hopes and dreams into your left hand now. Speaking out loud what you hope this planet could be, what you wish for the beings who inhabit it. Keep going. And now speaking aloud, what are the positive qualities or the traits that you're able to access in yourself that you can bring to this situation to realize this dream? Speaking those aloud in the present tense. Allow yourself to feel any physical sensations that arise, really soaking up any feelings of warmth or openness. What is it that you bring? What is it that you bring to create change in this world? If you're having trouble accessing that, you might ask yourself, where or when do I feel the most interconnected with this planet? Or what is my greatest hope for humans and non-human beings? And having spoken those aloud, really tune into this deep sense of caring. Really be kind to yourself. Remember that our negativity bias makes it hard for us to recognize positive traits in ourselves. But allow yourself to experience what this hope feels like in the body. Usually, speaking in the present tense brings about positive senses of joy or peace or calm. So just allow yourself to rest in this experience as fully as you can, really feeling it at a physical level. And speaking aloud, any final thoughts now? When you feel complete, sealing those words into your left hand, and just gently lower it into the lap. And take a few slow, deep breaths into the heart, into the center of the chest, this place of acceptance and compassion. I'll ask you to gently place your right hand, representing the worried or troubled aspect of your mind, just right in the middle of your chest on the heart center. And allow this connection between the hand and the heart to hold all of your worries and fears evoked by this situation. And just breathe deeply as you practice surrounding those challenging emotions with an attitude of kindness and compassion. And just stay for a moment to really integrate this experience. Finding space for the heart to hold all of our worries and fears. Now place your left hand on your heart center, just next to or even on top of your right hand. And with that gesture, creating this kind of symbolic bridge between these two seemingly divided parts of ourselves. And integrating both our fears and our hopes with kindness and non-judgment. And take a few deep, wholehearted breaths into this experience, into these two parts of yourself. And resting deeply in the knowledge that they can coexist. They do coexist. And let's take one more deep closing breath here. Inhale through the nose. And exhale out the mouth. And when you feel complete, you can lower both arms on either side of the body, palms preferably facing upward. And release any visualizations or physical sensations, just relax back. And just reflecting for one final moment here from this clearer and calmer perspective, what is the most skillful action you could take to address this situation? And this might be an inner action rather than an external action. Once you have your most skillful action or response, speak it in your own words. So I want you to say something like this. You can say, here are my fears and concerns. In the right hand, here is my vision in the left hand. And here is the most skillful action I can and will take. So speak that aloud in your own words now. Once you've spoken that aloud, again, one more phrase. I want you to all say, the result of this, I turn over to life itself. I cannot control the outcome. And just choose whatever language or vocabulary suits you. Speak that aloud now. We end by acknowledging that this climate crisis is beyond any one individual's control, and we can only do our best. Now just rest for a few moments in a posture that feels open and receptive, perhaps with your palms facing up, inviting in this sense of acceptance. And take a couple breaths to complete this process, bringing yourself back to your body slowly. Maybe some gentle movement to the fingers or the toes. Just open your eyes whenever you feel ready. And slowly come back to the screen in your own time, no rush. It's quite an introspective exercise, so be gentle with yourself, take your time. You might want to jot down some things if you had a kind of aha moment and want to just write a quick reflection. Take your time for that. I'm wondering, Megan, if we should do anger and then bio break, or if we should maybe do a break now. What do you think? How are you guys feeling?
Yeah, I was still very kind of, I don't know, zen after one of those exercises. So I'm wondering if it's a good moment to sort of, just break for 10 minutes, maybe go get a drink of water, stretch it out, rather than rush us right back into another
Especially
topic.
into anger. Feels like a hard transition.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't we take 10 minutes? So it is 3:01. So let's all come back at 3:11 or in 10 minutes, depending on wherever you are.
And I'll stick around if anybody wants to chat about that experience, what it was like for you.
Okay, see everyone soon.
All right, see you soon.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I got myself a cup of tea. All right, so we are going to be continuing with the topic of anger. And this is a topic that it did come up yesterday, and it was sort of one of the words that was explored in the word cloud and in broadening our emotional landscapes. It's also a topic that has been of interest to both Dale and I for quite a while now. And I absolutely think it has its place within discussions around climate distress. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Perfect. So we have a picture of good old Greta Thunberg there. We chose this image because she has been accused by some, perhaps most infamously by Donald Trump, who mocked her on Twitter, who really made light of her sense of anger, her outrage. She was accused of having an anger management problem, and she was told to chill. Try going to an old-fashioned movie with a friend. So obviously problematic for so many reasons, but very minimizing of her emotions and her experiences. But anger does have a negative reputation among many. Compared to the so-called positive emotions. We discussed yesterday why it's problematic to dichotomize between the positive and the negative emotions. But there's many reasons for why anger has a bad rap in society. This could be due to cultural, social, or religious reasons. Within many world faiths, there's an emphasis on the sort of the more positive side of experiences and sort of pushing down on anger. As well, maybe we can think of somebody in our lives who we know that we may think of having an anger issue. Perhaps they're unable to sort of control their anger, and this has led to aggression or perhaps violence. And so we associate anger with these people. There's also some interesting historical reasons within the Western context. For example, there's some interesting research by Stearns and Stearns, which points to how the contemporary focus on emotional control or pushing down anger actually reflects an Enlightenment era commitment to restricting individualistic responses and emotions like anger, which may be seen as circumnavigating legalized civil and consensus building processes. There's also a number of tropes or stereotypes that are associated with anger. So before we get into the usefulness of anger, its role, it is worth pointing out first that the anger that I perhaps exhibit could be interpreted very different than the anger exhibited by somebody else. And so our subjectivities really influence the way that our anger is perceived by others. So one trope is that of the angry activist. This is the stereotype of the perpetually mad and maybe self-righteous activists, perhaps the eco-warriors. There's an interesting study cited there, which found that the survey participants within the study who held negative stereotypes of environmental activists, who viewed them as eccentric and militaristic or militant, really associated these negative stereotypes with them. And as a result, this reduced their willingness to affiliate themselves with the activists or to adopt any of the behaviors that the activists were promoting. There's also the trope of the angry feminist. We've likely all heard of this one. This is a very misogynistic view of women, which disparages the arguments of typically female academics and activists and sort of just passes them off as just angry. And what this does is it really delegitimizes feminist arguments and undermines feminist policies. The last is that of the angry Black woman or the angry Black man. This trope refers to the stereotype of Black individuals as just perpetually and perhaps irrationally angry due to their perceived racial discrimination. So in the West, the context of this is it was popularized around the 1970s after the successes of the civil rights movement. And again, this stereotype was really used to discredit, to minimize, to silence the very valid concerns that Black people had regarding their treatment in society. So the reason why we point out these tropes, and likely there are many others, is because we want to acknowledge that anger carries very different benefits and risks for people depending on many intersectional factors of gender, sexuality, race, age, and more. And as well, so many of us have been conditioned to fear or negatively judge displays of anger, particularly in certain segments of the population. So as a result, we may be hesitant to display anger ourselves, even if we're angry about something as frustrating as climate change. I'll open the floor to you now. Would anybody like to add anything to these tropes, or perhaps to this concept of us being conditioned to believe that anger is a negative emotion? Could anybody relate to that?
It just made me think of something that's in the news at the moment. I think it literally just happened really recently. There was just Stop Oil protesters that have thrown soup on a Van Gogh painting. And it's really interesting watching the kind of social media reaction on that. And yeah, I think that fits into this kind of stereotype. People are just going, you know, they're unhinged, like this is ridiculous, it's irrational, it's unjustified. And yeah, I think a lot of the reaction is feeding into this kind of this trope that these people aren't to be believed, and to discredit the point that they're trying to make through their action.
100%. Yeah, and it really sort of overshadows the bigger topic at issue and focuses on the actions of a small minority. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
I was just reflecting too on, as you were speaking, Megan, that like we tend to equate anger and violence, and they're actually not the same thing. Like anger is the feeling, the violence is a behavior, and there is like a choice there about how we handle and express and manage anger. And yeah, as someone, I think I might have mentioned this when I introduced myself yesterday, but I used to work as a domestic violence counselor. And so the concept of unmanageable anger is hugely problematic in that world, because children grow up fearing those kinds of angry outbursts and really living in fear, as do their parents or survivors of abuse. So yeah, I just was kind of struck when you were speaking that I hadn't really fully separated those conceptually, like anger and violence. Like they tend to be kind of woven together. We don't realize it.
100%. Yeah, thank you for that reminder. So yes, anger itself, it's an emotion. Anger itself is not the problem. It's what we do with it, as I think you did just point out, Dalen. So let's not pass off anger as useless or always dangerous, something to be avoided or fear. There's a lot of interesting research coming out from social and evolutionary psychologists and brain scientists, mental health professionals, which are showing that anger has really valuable qualities and how it can be how it can be useful for environmental activism. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is a really good book. Might recommend The Upside of Your Dark Side, if you are interested in diving a bit deeper into the different values of anger. There are many values, but for the sake of time, we'll just focus on 3, and we may have time to open it up if you have any other ideas. But what is anger useful for? First of all, anger protects us. We've spoken before about sort of the evolutionary value of different emotions, and anger is one of those emotions. It evolved to help keep us safe. So our fight response, which evolved so we could defend ourselves from enemy or dangers, this stems from anger. And anger is really embedded in our primitive need to live and protect ourselves. It sharpens our focus and it activates our senses to protect ourselves and those we love and the planet around us. Anger also makes us aware of injustice. Sometimes we can refer to this as righteous anger. This is the flood of emotion that we get when we see something that we know just is not right. It is unjust, it is exploitative. And anger can serve as our sort of internal guidance system that indicates something is not right and change is needed. And I think anger is one of the most powerful internal catalysts. Can you think of any emotion that is more potent than this sense of righteous anger? Think of a time perhaps when you saw something unfolding, perhaps the way somebody on the street was being treated or a family member, and think back to the physiological changes that happened to your body. Your adrenaline probably shot up. Your muscles probably clenched, your heart rate increased. I mentioned yesterday, I get really hot under the collar, my blood is pumping. So even if you choose not to act, your body and your mind are primed for action. And on a global and systemic level, this collective anger of injustice, like climate injustice, can and does lead to greater accountability being demanded by politicians and companies. And it really increases the sort of social and economic cost of harming the environment. And lastly, anger motivates us. This is very closely connected to the last one. But not only does anger help us to recognize injustice, but it does help motivate us to do something about it. So similar to how our ancestors were primed to fight the threats that they faced, anger is really what helps to enable us to overcome the obstacles that are going to come in our path on the way to bringing positive change. So we do have time. Just curious, can anybody think of any other values of anger?
I feel like in a way it sometimes brings people together. Like if there's a common cause of anger, it also like divides people. So I don't know if those two things kind of counteract each other, but that sense of solidarity that emerges out of like a common enemy is not always a bad thing.
Unfortunately, when you said that, the first thing that came to my mind was mob justice.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, yes, that can happen. And, as you mentioned, anger can be either a source for good or for bad. So it is obviously complicated, but absolutely, I think anger can and does bring people together. Amazing. So let's keep moving on then. So anger is a natural and it is an adaptive response to threats. And a certain amount of anger is actually necessary for our own survival and the survival of the planet. There's some interesting research coming out that shows that anger is an important precursor to social activism, so like environmental activism, that motivates people to act and engenders a sense of rightness about their behavior. So one of these scholars is Dr. Monique Turner of Michigan State University. And she's conducting research into something called the anger activism model, or AAM. And she looks at the way of how people cognitively process activism campaign messages. And she found that emotions, including anger, is really predominant in the decision-making processes of campaign audiences. And that anger is a positive motivator in behavioral change. The anger activism model makes an interesting distinction between the usefulness of anger and feelings of self-efficacy. Or in other words, if we believe that we can actually affect change, then anger becomes a useful motivator, a useful tool. So people who are made to feel angry but feel they can do something about it are more likely to engage in deeper thought processing. However, anger can become counterproductive when the opposite is true. So if people have weak self-efficacy beliefs or low confidence that they can do something about a problem, so for example, the problem of climate change is just way too big, then that anger becomes counterproductive. It doesn't have a good outlet, and it can be followed by aggression, burnout, or impulsiveness. I'll put it out there again. Can anybody think of a time when you experienced feelings of anger paired with high levels of self-efficacy or confidence that you could actually do something to change something, or the opposite, when you felt angry, but there was nothing you could do to fix a problem? And what was the outcome of that?
I have just a really stupid example from last night. I ordered takeaway and one of the items didn't get delivered, and I went through the app and registered it, and I went through the whole process, and then it just took me to the standard screen that said, sorry you had a bad experience, but basically there's nothing we can do about it. And I was so angry because I followed the exact process that they designed. But I did feel this sense of efficacy, because I would say like one of my strengths is like communication. And I've kind of got a reputation amongst my friends for being like an effective complainer against companies when companies try to screw you over. So I was like, no, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to write an email, and it's going to be the best email I've ever written, and I'm going to get my money back for those chips that didn't arrive. And I was kind of riled up about it, even though it was this really like meaningless, pointless thing. So yeah, I guess that hopefully that could apply to like more meaningful issues as well. But yeah, in terms of a time when it's been kind of counterproductive without it, just another kind of non-climate example. I started watching that kind of the series, I think it was called This England, that was kind of about the COVID crisis and how it was handled by the government. And it was, did a really good job of contrasting like all of these tragic stories of people who had had health issues and their, the impact on their families and so on, with, the kind of government not really doing anything about it. And I did get really, really angry, and I just got quite upset. And, obviously this was in the past, so necessarily I couldn't do anything about it. And I just had to completely withdraw myself from the situation. I was like, I'm not going to watch this anymore. It just makes me too upset. And I just kind of took a step back, and disengaged, I guess. So yeah, not related to the topic, either of them really, but I would say I've definitely experienced both of those and the difference between them.
Thank you. It doesn't have to be related to the climate. Thank you for those both really good examples. Thank you for being a takeout food champion, and persisting. The world is a better place because of people like you.
I love strongly worded email as well. Strongly worded emails are like my forte. I love it.
Exactly. No, both really good examples. In the first case, you did have an outlet to direct your anger to. You had the option of sending that email. And in the latter, what can you do about such a big challenge? We kind of just simmer in that anger. It goes nowhere. Thanks so much. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So sort of continuing on about kind of this tricky balance of how anger can be both productive and protective and motivating, and how it can also be destructive. There's a psychologist, John Riskind, who's an anger expert, and he talks about how anger becomes problematic when we believe that the events that are triggering our anger is accelerating. So the risk is accelerating, but the window for action, if we believe that we can do something, if we believe the window for taking action is quickly disappearing, so sort of accelerating risk and shrinking window for action. And this is what causes people to act impulsively, but can actually make the situation worse. So think about somebody with road rage. I'm thinking of my brother who has unbelievable road rage. And the speed at which things are happening on the road is happening so fast. And so you think that you only have a very short window of time to act and show your frustration to the person that just cut you off. And so you act, thinking again about the time it takes for thoughts to kind of move from the front to the back of our brain, not giving it 90 seconds, as Dalen mentioned, but just acting. And this can lead to accidents. We see this all the time on the road. So Riskind's advice, he compares it to sort of a speedometer. And checking the speed limits, he says, of our anger, checking in how we're feeling. And this is building upon what Dalen's been telling us about the usefulness of checking in, of pausing, of naming accurately what it is we're feeling, because it can actually then change our responses and reactions to things. So the first step is to pause and assess, Riskin says. Is our anger increasing, decreasing, or remaining stable? And he gives us an anger speedometer. And apologies for all the car metaphors, but I quite like it for this case. So if you're going at 90 miles an hour and above, that's when your anger is boiling. It is explosive. It can be violent. At the other end of the spectrum, if we're going 30 miles an hour below, I don't know how we came up with these numbers. This is a state of calm and peace and tranquility. So I don't have all the speeds there, but this is in the book that we had on the previous slide, and it is hyperlinked here. So you can check it off if you want, check it out if you want. But I thought this was quite interesting because when we say we're angry, what do we actually mean? And we spoke yesterday about widening our anger, our emotional vocabulary, drawing from Brene Brown's work. So I think this is a good reminder for us. When we say we're feeling angry about climate change, there may be other emotions that we're experiencing. And so if we try and place ourselves, even right now on the speedometer, how are we feeling about climate change? Are we boiling, or are we just pissed off, perhaps? And naming our feelings and naming exactly what kind of anger we're feeling is really important for generating a greater sense of control over our emotions. If we're going at 90 miles an hour, this is where anger becomes overwhelming. It becomes all-encompassing. It leaves no psychological breathing room for other emotions. And rather than catalyzing us into productive and healthy action, it can be counterproductive. It just leaves us feeling irate all the time. We don't have the outlets. We just heard a really good example from Kirsten of a good example of when there was an outlet and that anger was able to be mediated. So let's consider what is within our control to actually change, and who is our anger directed to? Is it to politicians and industries that aren't making helpful policies fast enough? We don't have the power. Personally, us as individuals, we don't have the ability to do anything about that risk. And so for that reason, if we're going 90 miles an hour, with that being the perceived risk, this is just going to lead us to feeling overwhelmed and eventually burned out. So a more sustainable level of anger at a slower rate is needed. So perhaps irritation, frustration. I'm going to open the floor again. Be curious to know, does anybody have any thoughts on this process of measuring and naming kind of the level of anger measured against sort of the level of threat and our ability to make change?
I was just going to say really quick, one of my favorite meditation teachers, her name is Tara Brach, and she has a PhD in psychology, but she's also lived in a Tibetan Buddhist ashram for about 20 years. She, in her meditations around anger, she's also a big activist, and she does meditations on anger where she always offers this inquiry of like, what's underneath the anger, which I think is a really important reflection, because as she talks about, anger is like the flag. Anger is like, okay, something's not right here, something's going on. But when we act from that place, it's not usually the most skillful action. And so like looking, as you mentioned, it's often a combination of like multiple emotions. And so like looking under the hood, not to use another car metaphor, but is like often really helpful to figure out, okay, what actually am I feeling and how can I respond to that rather than just bouncing off the walls. Sorry, Sam, I think I might have cut you off. I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I was just saying this is actually a really good metaphor to describe how much anger you're feeling, and basically to, I guess, put it in a very concrete manner, because emotions generally do have a very abstract, non-concrete way of describing them. Sorry, people have a very abstract way. So this is actually a really good way of describing how much anger you're feeling, and the whole anger risk and the window shrinking analogy. That's also very, very interesting. I mean, I just feel when I was just looking at this and just going back and thinking about my own feelings of anger towards climate change and towards what people are doing or rather not doing for it, I guess I would say I would probably feel I would be somewhere between the 45 miles per hour to 60 miles per hour. It keeps going between these two levels. Some days, sometimes I feel it's probably, I'm just annoyed, irritated, frustrated that people aren't doing things, or not only individuals, but communities and government agencies. And sometimes I just feel pissed off, to the point where it's like, is there even any point? I mean, me individually doing anything, is there even any point? So yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing this. It's a really good analogy.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing. And I'm glad you find it useful. I do too. And I agree. It sort of brings a concrete lens to a very abstract concept. Emotions are slippery things to talk about. So yeah, glad to hear it maybe brought some clarity. Okay, let's move on. We're going to be talking about resilience. This is another theme that came up yesterday. There we go. And not just resilience, but collective resilience. Dalen and I try our best to move away from thinking of resilience as merely an individualistic tactic. It really has to be approached from a systems perspective. Let's go on to the next slide. So we do want to think first about the context. Apologies, Dalen. Is there the slide after this? Can you just remind me? Okay, that's fine. Sorry, go back. Thank you. Okay, so yes, just thinking about the context, like I mentioned, we're looking at this through a collective lens and thinking of resilience as a social phenomenon, not just an individualistic. And for us academics, we believe that conversations have to evoke and include the wider research and institutional ecosystem. Many of us are studying complex, difficult issues that are related to climate change, either directly or indirectly. If we're researching these subjects, it's likely that we come into very close contact with those who are suffering, or we see the environment changing around us. Perhaps we're in a field site where we can see it very up and close. And distress is contagious. We can become profoundly affected by the things that we see and hear. So it's definitely tough to find that balance between remaining present and engaged, but not burning yourself out. And this was particularly challenging among social science researchers. Dr. Christina Maslach is somebody that Dan and I cite quite often. She's an American professor who studies burnout in individuals who work within people-focused careers, nurses, doctors, but also volunteers, humanitarians, activists. And she finds that people who engage very closely with other individuals, like ourselves, for example, we typically have very high degrees of empathy. But empathy is a double-edged sword. It can give us really good interpersonal skills, which are crucial for building and maintaining rapport and drawing out insights. But empathy can also be a liability. If we have excess emotional empathy, not just cognitive, which is seeing people hurt, but emotional, which is then taking on their hurt, this means that we are particularly prone to emotional burnout, and we can easily slip into secondary trauma or vicarious trauma and experience emotional burnout. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. So we're talking about psychological resilience here. So having looked a bit at the context in which we're looking at it, the setting of our fieldwork, the topics of what we're researching, let's look a bit about what do we actually mean when we say resilience within the context of our work. There is no single definition, but a common one is that of rebounding or bounce back ability. It means the ability to adapt, to be flexible within challenging experiences. Another common definition is the ability to withstand and rebound from disruptive life experiences, and importantly, strengthened and more resourceful. So you're not just making it through, you're actually coming out from that adverse experience even stronger than before. Oftentimes you see the metaphor of the rubber band. Rubber bands, like people, are subjected to different tensions and challenges. They have different thicknesses and abilities to stretch further or shorter. And with normal use, a rubber band will not break. But if you expose that band to adverse external influences like heat or extreme cold, the rubber band quickly deteriorates and can snap. So that metaphor only goes so far. And the good news is that human beings are not rubber bands. We're not useless if we break, and our resilience can actually be grown and rebuilt. This idea of collective resilience, let's go on to the next slide. There we go. So there's a German psychologist named Steffi Bednarak, who calls for a collective response to global ecological disaster. So she talks about something called a window of tolerance, which is an emotional range that we can engage with really difficult truths like climate change, while still supporting healthy self-regulation. And her research shows that individuals' personal resilience to withstand trauma and distress, like around climate change, is increased through connection to strong social networks and supportive relationships. So really key here, the building and the sustaining of community is a way of increasing resilience, both individually and collectively. So what this research demonstrates that in the face of climate change, what we need most is connection to each other, connection to our community, to nature. And it's just remembering that climate change is a collective problem. It is not our problem alone. It's a collective problem, and so responses should also be collective. Within your university context, you may want to consider joining a peer support group if you have not already. Of course, there's upsides and downsides. Peers can provide a really important sounding board and space for solidarity. Thinking back to my master's and PhD, it was largely conversations around the pub table and these informal peer support networks where I was able to ask questions that I maybe wasn't comfortable asking my supervisors. There are downsides, so just be cautious. It can lead to greater burdens being placed upon people who are already stretched thin and may not have the emotional or mental bandwidth to be able to carry those shared burdens. So just approach peer support groups carefully and cautious and aware of everybody's capacity for burden sharing. If you're feeling isolated, you can also consider joining a local climate support group. This is something that Dalen mentioned before. There's a great website that we've hyperlinked in here, Climate and Mind, which has resource section with links to workshops and discussion groups, both virtually and in person around the world. There's also something here which we've hyperlinked in here, networks, the Good Grief Network. You can see if there's any workshops near you. And sharing stories is so important for community building. There's a great website called Eco Anxious Stories, also linked in there. And their mission is to give people the courage and the tools and the energy to connect with like-minded individuals and continue the fight together rather than alone. I think we'll continue on to the next slide just for the sake of time. Yeah, sorry, the next one, apologies. Thank you. I didn't want to wrap up discussions around resilience without going into this idea of decolonizing climate distress. We're calling for climate justice. We are calling for systems change, but institutionally, there's still a lack of awareness of how exactly the climate crisis intersects with other social injustices like racism, sexism, wealth inequality. We did speak briefly about this yesterday. So decolonization, you've likely heard of it before. It means different things in different contexts. Generally, it means unlearning social constructs that were implemented because of colonial practices and reinforced through neo-colonialization. Within the academic context, Indigenous scholar Linda Chuai Smith states that decolonizing knowledge production means having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform research practices. So where are we getting our knowledge? How are we getting it? Whose voices are not being heard? And sometimes it means unlearning things that we've learned before. And conversations around climate distress often rely on the production and the transmission of lessons from just particular kind of subsets of the population that overlooks kind of the voices of Indigenous individuals, for example. This can perpetuate really neo-colonial mindsets and research practices and personal practices of how we respond to climate distress, really overlooking, neglecting diverse and important ways of knowing and responding to climate change. So in the context of the climate crisis, it's not just about rejecting Western capitalist oppressions or unsustainable growth, but it's actually about reversing a lack of appreciation for the power of community and collective strategies for well-being that are already taking place around the world and have been for centuries. We should have the collective goal to think through the entire structure and approach to challenging climate grief and really approaching it with marginalized voices at its core. So one way forward is to be conscious of what information we're consuming. Where is it coming from? We can make efforts to consume more content from BIPOC individuals, for example, from people who are engaged in fighting climate injustice, from marginalized, from Indigenous communities. There's an interesting study here that I've linked in from Consuelo Willox, who looked at responses to climate change among Canada's Indigenous peoples in the Arctic regions, the Inuit people. I thought this was a really beautiful example, and there's so many more, but just for the sake of time, her study looks at how within the Inuit language, the pronouns or the terms that are given to the environment are very similar to the pronouns that are given to people. So there's no sort of segregation of the environment and people. You know, the earth is sort of seen as this mother figure and giver of life and holds a certain personhood. And so the degradation of the Arctic, which is happening at a really rapid pace and has all sorts of bad ripple effects for their way of living, has resulted in communal rituals of mourning and communal grief. It's almost like holding funerals for family members. And this study is showing how this practice of collective mourning creates space and time for sort of sharing emotions. It also generates greater senses of efficacy among the mourners and their ability to bring positive change. Dalen, it's up to you if you think we have time to just sort of have a quick plenary discussion, or if we should continue on to the widening voices exercise.
Well, we can open it up. Is that if anybody feels like they have reflections on the concept of resilience, specifically collective resilience.
And also I'd be curious to know if anybody has any insights or thoughts on this issue of kind of decolonizing climate distress and climate justice.
The point you made about kind of communal mourning, it just made me think of something I'm hoping to look at in the kind of creative workshops that I'll be running as part of my PhDs, is the idea of glacier deaths and glacier funerals, which is kind of becoming more widespread in regions that are affected by in that way by global warming, like melting glaciers and things like that. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting practice, this idea of extending our celebration and our compassion to the non-human, and especially not just in terms of other animals as well, like to kind of non-living things like, you know, rocks or whatever. I think, yeah, that's a really powerful way to kind of change our relationship to the rest of the natural world. And yeah, I think kind of recognizing the indigenous roots of a lot of these practices is really important.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Yeah, I agree. It is a very powerful practice and one that requires a lot of, I think, patience, because it is such a radical shift in our cognitive frame. Because the minute you start seeing non-human beings as sentient and, you know, life-giving, life-receiving, worthy of protection, our whole society and like the premises that it's built on kind of like crumbles and starts to look really, really scary and problematic. And that is such a kind of like earth-shaking idea that I think it's hard for people to truly come into contact with it. I was just going to say, I do nature therapy, so I'm completing my certification to lead forest bathing walks and do kind of nature therapy one-on-one with folks. And yeah, that is one of the central tenets, and bringing people into relationship with non-human life in that way. And it's beautiful to do it in kind of like small little vignettes. But it's a pretty radical idea.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Of course, there is so much more to be said on the topic of decolonizing climate justice and our approaches to climate distress. But hopefully this does just give you a little bit of food for thought. Let's continue on. We're going to do an exercise now. So stemming from this discussion on widening our sources of knowledge and approaches to climate change, we're going to do an exercise that will help grow our ability to have compassion for others, including compassion for those who may believe very different things than we do when it comes to climate change. So as activists, as scholars, as researchers, we want to be able to express our own views and opinions, but importantly, we also have to be able to have greater understanding about differing views and understand why people think the way they do. So this exercise really helps us to do both. It allows us to express ourselves while also practicing radical compassion, which is letting go of that self-righteousness and actively widening our circles of understanding. So Dalen, I think we might as well, we can get away with just doing one group of three, if that sounds okay to you. Oop, just muted. I think you're saying yes.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, perfect.
Do you want me to create a breakout room?
I mean, I was thinking that might be good. What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure. So this is an exercise where you're going to be speaking from the perspective of different individuals. You're going to be speaking about the issue. We want you to think on an issue relating to climate change. And we want you first to take some time just to think about it, to find sort of an issue, any particular issue or situation that concerns you about climate change. And Dalen and I will model for you shortly, because I know it's quite abstract right now. So first, speaking, and you're going to be speaking in first person using the pronoun I for all of these. You're going to be sort of role playing. So the first is speaking about that issue from your own point of view, your own feelings about the issue. Then second, from the perspective of somebody who holds completely opposing views on the issue, still using the pronoun I believe, I feel. Then from the viewpoint of a non-human being who is affected by that particular situation. It might feel a little bit goofy or silly. It's okay to laugh. The point is really just to kind of, push yourself. And then lastly, in the voice of a future human whose life will be affected by the choices that are made now and still on the same issue. So I can model, if that's okay. So I'm going to be picking the issue of a steel plant, which is in my hometown. My hometown has one sort of major industry, which is the steel industry. And historically, it's where most individuals have been employed, including my brother, very harmful for the environment. So my opinion, I don't like the steel plant. I think it is harmful for the environment, and it produces a lot of cancer. We have one of the highest rates of lung cancer in the province because of the existence of this steel plant. And the evidence of environmental degradation in the area surrounding the plant is obvious. Okay, then number 2, from the perspective of a person who holds opposing views, I'm going to take on the viewpoint of my brother. I believe that the steel plant should stay. It is my source of livelihood. If the steel plant was no longer there, I would have to uproot my family and probably change cities. And then from a non-human perspective, I am a fish who lives in the river downstream, and my body is filling with contaminants. And future human. I am Megan's great-grandchild. I cannot swim in the rivers because they've been so polluted by toxins and sediment. And I can't play in the trees on the banks because they've died because of the acidity of the water. Okay, so that's just modeling. So yes, if we'll put you into one group of 3.
I'm thinking, Megan, for time's sake, it might be better to do partners. I think it's a little easier to do partners here. So do you mind
Sure.
going into a room with someone?
Not at all. Put me into a room. That's a good idea. We'll do partners. And we'll just take, let's see here. What do you think, Dalen, for timing?
Why don't we do 10 minutes, so 5 minutes each? Or is that, do we even need that much? Maybe.
I think probably a bit less. Why don't we do, we could aim for 5 minutes, giving everyone 2.5 minutes.
Okay.
I think that's doable just because we are running a bit behind time. So
Yeah.
let's try that.
All right, so 5 minutes. So it's 58 right now. So I'll see you back at 4:03. I'm going to open the rooms now.
Perfect. Hello.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
How was that?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, putting yourself in a lot of different perspectives and getting a more holistic view of the issue that I brought up. I mean, we're so caught up in our own narratives and our own way of looking at things. And I mean, this is actually something that I was talking with a few friends of mine a few days ago, how living in an echo chamber, regardless of how we view it as I am right and the other's wrong, and not even giving the other person space to express their views, kind of shuts the other person. This whole sense of us versus them is getting more and more ingrained in today's society. And this exercise actually puts us in the other person's shoes and try to look at the situation from their point of view. And honestly, this is some aspect of I really wish I get to explore in my PhD research. I mean, one of the aspects is how can we create messages that gets other people on board regarding the climate crisis, because people who are already engaged in it, people who are already aware of it, it's easy to put the message out to them. The challenge is how do we get people on board who either see it as a hoax or who are in denial about it. So this kind of exercise actually kind of helps to look at the situation from another person's point of view. So yeah.
Yeah,
For
especially
sure.
using the pronoun I is a really like powerful practice.
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. And you're right, Sam. Otherwise, it's just preaching to the choir. So,
True,
yeah.
true.
To be able to effectively engage with others, we must first understand where they're coming from and what they believe.
That's true.
So,
That's true.
yeah. Yeah. It's a tough thing, but well done. Okay. Dalen, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I just really want to take a stretch. So I don't know if you guys want to also. It's been kind of it's been a long day and we're almost done. So we'll breeze through this last section on hope and optimism. I promised you that we would end on hope and optimism, and there are good reasons for that. So yeah, take a few shoulder rolls, feel a little more comfortable in your body, and then we'll wrap up here shortly and maybe get you guys going a little early. So we've talked about why hope and optimism are integral to resilience. In her book, The How of Happiness, Sonia Lyubomirsky, if I'm saying that correctly, writes that optimism is not about providing a recipe for self-deception. The world can be a horrible, cruel place, and at the same time, it can be wonderful and abundant. These are both truths. There is not a halfway point. There is only choosing which truth to put in your personal foreground. So I think that kind of encompasses what we were trying to do in that mindfulness exercise earlier, the transformation technique exercise, is, you put the right hand with all of your fears and your worries on your heart first, and then you cover it with your left hand, because the kind of hopes and visions are really a balm for all of the fears and worries. And the willingness to kind of hold that duality creates space for compassion and inner wisdom and creativity to arise. So referring back to this Hayes article, which I mentioned yesterday, research shows that we need active hope in order for environmental interventions to be successful. Denial and pessimism simply does not lead to pro-environmental behavior. So if you're going to be hopeful, not for your sake, then at least do it for the planet's sake, and hope is more accessible than it feels sometimes. Again, my favorite meditation teacher, one of them, Tara Brach, she has this meditation where she kind of digs deep into these difficult emotions, and she kind of gets at the root of it, which is like, why is this so painful? And it's because we care, like this stuff hurts and is challenging and is frustrating and is hopeless because we actually care. We want the best for ourselves and the people that we care about and our planet and the beings that inhabit it. Why would we bother with any of this if we were already convinced of our own failure? So the fact that we are all here today and trying to do something, anything, is proof that we care at least a tiny bit, and we believe in our heart of hearts that some kind of change is maybe possible. Anger is also rooted in hope, by the way. We're angry because we think that we should be doing better, and that we can do better. We are capable of doing better. So climate distress arises because we care. We care what happens to us, and we care what happens to the planet. And as long as we still care, there is still hope. So active hope, again, this is a book by Joanna Macy. She wrote a book on the topic. She says that it's about finding and offering our best response when facing concerns about our world situation. So we get to really choose our response, and we need to be at our best. Active hope has these 3 key steps. The first is taking a clear view of the reality. The second is identifying the direction that we want things to move in. So knowing that we have an endpoint, a goal. And then 3 is taking concrete steps to change things. 3 strategies for eco-optimism. These are things that we've already touched on. Just kind of reiterating what we've already talked about: seeking out the wins, celebrate the good where we can, counteract that negativity bias. Coming back to earlier discussions on collective resilience, it is a powerful strategy and a vital source during crisis, providing those collective contexts for shared identity and solidarity, drawing on community support. The UK, let's see, oh, that's not this week, Megan, is it? The UK's National Loneliness Awareness Week, I think, is in June. It's just slightly outdated, but there are networks like the climate cafes that I mentioned earlier as well, from Climate Psychology Alliance, and those kinds of spaces are key, as is gratitude. There are a lot of studies that demonstrate the strong positive impacts of gratitude on psychological well-being. So my mom had me keeping a gratitude journal when I was like 3 years old. And it's actually hilarious, this like notebook because I couldn't even write when I was 3 years old, and so she would write for me and I would dictate like, I'm grateful for my little sister, I'm grateful for my cat, I'm grateful, and then there are like these pictures where I would try to draw my little sister, and it's literally just like a circle for her head with 2 stick legs coming out of the circle. So that's just kind of a silly example, but gratitude journaling is incredibly powerful. And one caveat there is that it has to be accompanied by the why. So why are you grateful for that thing? What is it about it that brings you joy or comfort? So in that check-in exercise, when we were reflecting on a place that we were grateful for, a natural space that was special to us, I also asked you, like, why is it special? And, Catherine, you said it was because it was a comfort to you in a really difficult time in your life. Same that lake that I used to go to all the time, it was a refuge when I needed to just think or like get away. There's no service up there. It's very remote. And I could just be by myself and with myself. So just really quick, I'm gonna ask you guys to write down 3 things that you're grateful for. You don't have to share them, so this is just for you. And intentionally keep it small. So it doesn't have to be like, I think we can tend to slip into like, oh my God, I have to list everything, all of my family members and all of my privileges I need to list on this gratitude journal. But let it be something small, like little things that people do for you, I'm grateful for the woman that smiled at me at the end of yoga class yesterday because, and why were you grateful for it? Because it was a small kindness from a stranger that made me kind of regain some faith in like the goodness of people that I don't necessarily know. So I'll give you a few minutes to write down 3 things that you're grateful for. Doesn't have to be climate related, by the way. I'll just give you another minute or so. Writing down 3 things that you're grateful for and why you're grateful for them. Doesn't have to be longhand. You can just do bullet points if that's easier. And just finishing your final thoughts. Anything else you want to add? And then if anybody wants to share something that they're grateful for, you're more than welcome to, but don't feel like you have to. Or if you want to share what that was like for you, if you noticed any physiological changes as you reflected on things that you were grateful for. I know that for me, when I practice gratitude, I usually get kind of like a fullness and a swelling around my heart. And it's kind of it's not constriction because it's not a tightness, but it's a fullness, and like a little bit of warmth. That's usually what it feels like for me, but maybe it's different for you. Anybody? No? Okay, no problem. Okay, so I just want to end on one final note. In times of grief or anxiety, or when we feel like we're getting close to apathy or disassociation, awe and imagination are 2 very powerful forces. So, like I said, I'm currently completing my certification to be a nature immersion therapist. For those of you who don't know what forest bathing is, it's originally a Japanese practice known as Shinrin-yoku. And it was developed after a period of industrialization and mass urbanization in Japan after the Second World War, when they saw a rise in a lot of serious physical health issues and mental health issues, and identified the lack of connection with the natural world as one huge contributing factor. And so they developed this practice of bringing people closer to natural environments, specifically in the forest. They did all these studies on the way that our bodies interact with the phytocidins that are produced by all plants, but specifically trees, and especially conifer trees. So there's tons of studies and interesting research that I can point you towards if it's something you're interested in. I also sometimes run excursions around Edinburgh. If you guys ever want to join, you'd be most welcome. But the goal is really to reconnect people with their belonging to the earth in a way that is very embodied and sensory and experiential, that inspires awe. And there's actually a really unique kind of differentiation between awe and wonder. So the psychologists Wagman and Wager differentiate between them in saying that wonder inspires the wish to understand. So it has this kind of like curious component, this desire to understand. There's like a want there. Whereas awe inspires the wish to let shine, to acknowledge and to unite. So awe has this kind of deep existential quality that humbles us and shows us how small we are in relation to this vast universe. And I think that that's part of the reason these natural spaces hold so much power for us. These kinds of places that we all talked about in the very beginning, is that is powerful medicine for us to be reminded of our place in the universe. When our brains are, not necessarily designed to always see the bigger picture in that way. We're built to focus on the immediate and the next big threat and the next big obstacle. So I'm just a huge advocate for spending as much time in nature as you can and letting yourself be awestruck by the beauty of the world that we are lucky enough to live in. We can't let the fear of the future rob us of the beauty of the present. And imagination is also the ultimate antidote to cynicism. So hopelessness and despair really stifle our creativity and therefore our potential solutions. We really need all of our creativity and all of our imagination to explore new ways of thinking that can help us build a future that is, liberated from the injustice of existing systems. So I wanted to end on that happy note. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to open it up to you guys now if we have any kind of final reflections, questions, and if not, we do have a short evaluation that we can maybe have you guys take, and then we'll let you go. Oh, Megan's already pasted it in the chat. Great. What do you guys think? Any final thoughts?
Just wanted to ask, so obviously a big part of this was about kind of sitting with feelings that we usually kind of judge as negative and things like that. And I'm just wondering if you have any experience of like how you balance this with the demands of ethical research. Like how do you go about creating a space where it's safe for people to feel negative emotions or maybe feel distressed and work through that? That's just something I'm kind of going through at the moment. I'm going through the ethical approval process for my research, and I'm saying, I want to look at creative writing as a kind of outlet for maybe processing some of these emotions, but in all my forms I have to say, like, explain how you're not going to cause any distress to people and things like that. So I just wondered if you could kind of speak to that tension.
Yeah, totally. Well, do you want to say something, Megan, or can I?
No, just it's a really good question. It's something, so Dalen and I have delivered workshops on sort of the role of auto-reflexivity. So not how we impact our research, but how our research impacts us personally, and how there's often a lack of space within our writing to actually talk about that. And then have also talked about how psychological risks are often either minimized within academia, or it's not necessarily given place, or it's sort of brushed off, or even for liability reasons, our institutions sort of insist that we have very low risk for engaging with our participants. Yet what about risk to us? And also what about, respecting the autonomy of our participants to kind of speak up and share their truths and decide for themselves. So it is something that we have explored, and we would be happy to share some resources with you, Kirsten. Dalen, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just thinking in a very practical sense, there's certain things that you can do, like structures for support that you can have in place, like having a mental health professional present or going through a trauma sensitivity training yourself. And I think it is worthwhile writing those into your ethics and considering what is actually feasible, because obviously all of those things cost money, and that is something that is in short supply for most researchers. So those are kind of the practical things. But then also I think in a more personal way, there is like a quality of presence that you can bring in with you, which you will, because the fact that you're willing to get close to these emotions and that you don't shy away from them, and that you create space for other people to step into. But at the end of the day, it's their choice whether or not they choose to step into that space. And like giving people that kind of birth to make the choice for themselves is one of the key tenets of trauma sensitivity, you know. And a lot of us have been or are going through various degrees of trauma caused by the climate crisis. And so I think that could be really interesting. And if you wanted to look into, I know there's an organization here in Edinburgh called Health and Mind that does trauma sensitivity trainings that might be of interest. But I could definitely recommend some other ones that might be online and a little more accessible.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else have any thoughts or closing reflections?
I do find the material, the literature about this topic are quite useful, and I'm very interested into that. So I'm wondering, can you share the PPT, the PowerPoint to us? Yeah, because I really want to dig into some of the literature you mentioned, and I was doing my best to take some note, but I'm sure I do only take a little piece of that. I really would love to have a better look of the broader.
Yeah, definitely. We'll post it in the social group, so you guys will have access to this. So we've got all of the sources hyperlinked, so you can just find them right away.
Cool, thank you.
Along with the recording of the presentation as well will also be posted.
Yeah, building on what Catherine said, I tried accessing the YouTube link for yesterday's video, but it said it's a private video and I'm not able to access it.
I just saw your comment, Sam. Sorry about that. I must have uploaded it incorrectly. I'll go in and change the privacy settings.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Also, since I'm here, I'd like to thank the two of you for this session. It was very, very informative. For me, especially, like I said, my research is based on eco-anxiety and the climate anxiety. So it's given me a fresh outlook on how to go about tackling this issue and looking at different things in my research. So thank you to the both of you for this.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement and for coming both to day one and day two and hanging in there. We know it's not easy on a Friday afternoon, but yes, very appreciated to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Heartfelt thanks. It's been really, really wonderful. And you guys have been such a great and engaged group, and really, yeah, a pleasure to work with and to learn alongside. So we love hearing how you guys put this stuff into practice. So do stay in touch. You can follow us on social media if you want. And if you send us a message, it will be me or Megan who responds. So we're contactable on there, or obviously old-fashioned email. I actually don't know if you'll have our emails since we were mostly contacting you through social, but we can share those in the social group as well in case you want to get in touch. If you're ever in the area, you want to go for a forest bathing walk, let me know. And then don't forget to fill out that little evaluation form that Megan dropped the URL for. That's really helpful for us. Thank you guys so much. And I'll let you go enjoy your Friday. Hope you guys all have fun weekend plans.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.
Have a good weekend.
You
Thank
too.
you too. Bye, Catherine. Bye, Sam.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yay!
Yay, I'm so tired.
The weekend is here. Oh my God.
Please.
I think, okay, first of all, let me just say that your section on anger was amazing. I think
Oh,
that's
thank
such a,
you.
and so was the collective resilience, but
Mm.
I just think that that section was really impactful and I thought you did a great
Good.
job with it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think we should explore it further. We'll do a podcast or something.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And wow, I think that also we should really pat ourselves on the back for having such a successful workshop despite everything that we've both been dealing with lately. So, yeah.
100%. Let's celebrate this. Yay, air high five. We we got through the week. Arguably the most, intense, stressful, crazy week for both of us simultaneously in a while. And yet, one of the best workshops. So go us. So yes, let's celebrate that and take some very much needed rest.
Yeah. I'm gonna go home and let Banjo out, and then I'm gonna have some tequila.
That sounds amazing.
Make a margarita.
I love that. I have visions of like a personal pan pizza and a glass of wine. That's what I'm picturing.
Yeah,
That's
that
nice.
sounds pretty nice. I told Nico that I would make us margaritas and some like salsa. So I need to go to the store and get stuff for that.
Yum. Oh, well, I hope you can just, I know sometimes socializing can be more depleting than energizing, but I mean, Nico's great. So hopefully, it'll be fun and you'll have margaritas.
Yeah, I think it's just gonna be like a informal kind of catch up. So
that's good.
I'll get a early night and do some unpacking tomorrow.
My goodness. Well, let me know if you need a hand with anything. I'm happy to help.
You. That's nice of you. I think I got it all done.
Good for you. Amazing. So okay, are you going to be putting this on YouTube and then putting the link in there?
Yeah. Oh shoot! I just realized I need to stop